It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to be here with this panel. This exhibition started, if you can remember, back in March of 2020. But in the March of 2020, when we were still shaking hands, and about 2 weeks later, we were all at home after that. And this exhibition developed in partnership with the American Federation of Arts, with Chesterwood, the historic home and studio of Daniel Chester French, and with the Saint-Gaudens Memorial and the Saint-Gaudens National Historical Park. And it was really through this collaboration of the AFA, Chesterwood, and the Saint-Gaudens Park that we were able to come together to think about French and Saint-Gaudens, two of the leading, if not the leading, sculptors in America of the late 19th, early 20th century. And thinking about them as friendly rivals who so much of their work spoke to, at the time, this transformative age in America, in this period, age of great wealth, great growth, but also great inequities that roiled society. And we thought about French and Saint-Gaudens in this context, right? When we all go home in March of 2020, we're developing the exhibition, and we actually presented at the AFA's exhibition committee meeting just days after George Floyd was murdered. And we're thinking about the role of monuments in this context and in this moment, and how French and Saint-Gaudens monuments could speak to a time 110, 120, 130 years ago, and also how they continue to speak to us today. And that's really so much of the power of this exhibition that's on view, the power of the catalog, and I'm thrilled that Dana Pilson and Thayer Tolles, both authors from the catalog, are joining us tonight. And as we think about the show, we really were motivated by the importance of French and Saint-Gaudens, their sculptures, and the continuing power to shape and reflect ideas about America, and also the debates about the nation that continue to animate so many of our cultural conversations today. And it's a pleasure to be here with this panel specifically. We had a Zoom about a week and a half ago, and if we can mirror that, I think it would be an extraordinary success. So if we can just come close, that will be good. But one of the things that struck us as we were talking is so much of our focus about the monuments conversation is what's happening today, what's happening in our daily lives, what we see in the newspapers, what we see on the news. But this is a long conversation that's been happening in America, and the conversation, the debates about monuments are long-standing. And Wendy, you at the New York Historical Society curated an exhibition, Monuments, Commemoration, and Controversy. And part of what that did was set the stage historically for what today's conversations are. And if you could just kick us off by giving us some of that historical framework, that would be.
Sure, thanks. That was precisely the motivation behind the New York Historical Society show. We wanted to take these questions that were being asked so urgently in 2020, 2021, 2022 around monuments, and we wanted to take those heated debates and look at the way that questions and topics that seem so of this moment, of our day, actually have a very long history dating back in this country to the founding of the nation. So our exhibition sort of moved historically from 1776 around the gallery to the present day. And if I could, I'll just focus on one of the historical vignettes. I'll tell you a story about a monument to King George III that once stood in Bowling Green. As you know, if you know Bowling Green, that monument is no longer there. So what happened is that on July 9th, 1776, a number of New York colonists and continental soldiers gathered together in what's now City Hall Park, and they listened to a reading of the freshly written Declaration of Independence. And they grew very impassioned and very emboldened, and they turned and they marched down Broadway, and they headed toward Bowling Green with their sights set on this towering equestrian monument to the king that was on a pedestal 18 feet high in the air, larger than life size, gilt to reflect the sun, and showing King George presiding over this colony. And they took ropes and they tore that monument down. They then smashed the monument into pieces, they scraped the gilding off of the lead, and then they carted those pieces of lead off to Connecticut to be made into bullets for use by the Continental Army, specifically 42,088 bullets. One of the postmaster at the time reported that the royal troops would have melted majesty fired at them. And so, we had this vignette, we had a small-scale reproduction of the sculpture, we had fragments of the sculpture that were stolen back from loyalists that are in our collection, and we had 2 paintings related to that event that looked back on the event, as well as musket balls used in the war. And one of the questions we asked around this vignette is, were the colonists making or erasing history? And I remember that I went through the exhibition with a friend who read that and laughed and said, I love that you're asking a question that has such a clear answer. And I said, well, actually, I didn't mean it to have a clear answer, and it didn't have a clear answer at the time. There was debate over what colonists were doing by tearing this statue down. They ended up leaving the pedestal up for 40 years as a monument to revolution. And so that's just one example of the ways that we were trying in this exhibition to give our current debates the weight of history.
So Alvin, when you're creating public sculpture, how do is probably a better question, do the current debates, the current discourse about public sculpture play into your thinking about how you approach a public project, or how do you fit within this cultural moment as you're thinking as an artist?
Yes, it definitely does, because I guess growing up I grew up from Baltimore, Maryland, but it really didn't matter what state you grew up in. As a young black kid at the time, I didn't see a whole lot of representation of people that look like myself or other minorities represented in public art. Maybe you saw some select few in certain neighborhoods that they felt it related to, but usually when you went into any kind of center court or any kind of downtown or metropolitan area, it was just, there was no representation. Mm-hmm. So that is always kind of in the back of my mind, and now having the opportunity to be afforded the opportunity to help be a part of changing that landscape structure, I always think of what would I wanted to see, when I was a kid, then I can help maybe do something to kids that are now that will be walking through public spaces, seeing representations of whether it's either minorities, women, or everybody that didn't have a voice back then. And to Wendy's point, monuments have always, to some degree, oddly been left out of the conversation of the fine arts world in some strange, bizarre way. It's almost kind of like when you walk into a park and see many monuments of different, whether they're generals, war heroes, philanthropists, whatever, they almost become, to some degree, unfortunately, like furniture. Mm-hmm. And nobody really pays attention. It's like, okay, it's got a statue there that becomes a pigeon rest, but you're there having lunch and whatnot, and you really don't, oh, it's Lincoln, all right, whatever. And even when I was in art school, it's not really wasn't even talked about so much as the whole genre of monument art being part of the conversation. It's almost like if you weren't in a museum or a gallery, you just weren't considered on that radar of the fine arts world. And I think what's happening now, and it's probably even accelerated since the whole George Floyd riots and everything, when there was so much attention brought to monuments, is that, okay, this is not just public art, especially when you're talking about figurative sculpture in public art. It's no longer just these bland statues that fall into the background. They mean something, because every time there's a social upheaval or some sort of revolution, whether it's here, Iraq, or whatever, the first thing they go after is the monuments. So that means they obviously have some sort of power and influence socially that oddly has been ignored by the art world. So, all that is in my mind when I'm creating a piece, and I always think of what, like I said, what would I wanted to see when I was young, growing up. and how it's represented.
James Young talked about monuments being stones in the landscape without ritual or something to activate them, and I think that's what you're talking about with furniture. But Michele, you've written about monuments in so many different monuments in public art in so many different contexts. And how have you seen the discourse around them change in the last decade or so?
Well, one thing is that there is discourse, because as Alvin said, I mean, with the exception of a few people who I know in this room, I've been struggling with the biases against public monuments and public art from the beginning of my career, but for different kinds of reasons. I mean, now it has to do more with the subject matter. And in the past, it was the influence of abstract art, which dominated in the academy where I taught, where I learned. And so if with academic, figurative public art didn't fit into that kind of framework, so it was either ignored or disdained completely. And I set out to try to counter that a bit by looking at how they got there in the first place, and the people that put them up and the politics underlying them, and basically started looking at public monuments as municipal artifacts, which is how I view them now, to this day. And when you do a lot of research into those stories, every monument becomes fascinating. I mean, there's a story behind every single work that you see around you. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, enriches the landscape, whether the subject is a good guy or a bad guy, or, so in terms of the discussions now, that's the more dominant perspective of who the subject is and whether that subject belongs in public space. And I come at it from a different angle. But it has changed, and people are much more engaged with the landscape that, as you point out, a lot of people just, the main memorial, the works in Central Park, people don't know anything about them, and they kind of zone out when they walk past. And
And it's a really, really interesting point that you both have raised around this, because when you think about the art of French and Saint-Gaudens specifically, both of these sculptors work with such an extraordinary formal elegance. But that's not generally what we talk about when we speak about their monuments. We talk about the commissioning history, or how they got there, or who's represented, whatever it may be. So and maybe we can start with you, Alvin, on this, because of the art, where do you see aesthetics or artistry fitting into these conversations that are so driven by the civic conversation or the person conversation?
So to that point, and that's an interesting topic as well, going back to my other point when I said oftentimes when you go into public spaces, monuments are not often even acknowledged. They become just sort of the backdrop and landscape. And it's very interesting that, let's say, for instance, if you look at Mount Rushmore, I can't even think of the sculptor's name, it's just on the tip of my tongue right now. Gutzon Morgan, yeah. But his name's been lost in history, and he's got one of the most famous sculptors in the world. If you look at Michelangelo's David, it's always referred to as Michelangelo's David. Now, what is the difference between those two? Okay, well, one is an excellent technical marvel, like one of the wonders of the world on the side of a mountain, but it's almost, you're looking at it as portraiture. Okay, it looks like Abraham, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, but past that point, you don't even think about the artist, because it's become more about portraiture and the technical aspect of the marvel, the technical marvel that how it's created. So I think you get into this sort of duality, like, okay, how much of an artist's voice can you put present in doing, when you're doing painting when you're sculpting a figure, and where does your interpretation of that come in? I mean, Michelangelo is David, and he did religious figures, so the beauty of the liberation of that is that he can interpret it any way he wants to interpret it. Therefore, it becomes about the artist just as much as it is about who he's sculpting. Whereas when you look at, like I said, Rushmore, or even monuments of presidents or everything like that, the artist often gets lost in that because it's strictly about the portraiture and whoever is interpreted. So I think going forward, what's interesting in the day that we live in, age and time of technology, where you have 3D printers that can technically paint anything, or I'm saying that they can print anything more accurate probably than any of the best trained artists can do, it kind of takes you back to the old, I believe Picasso said one time, the photograph, when photography was taking over a lot of painting and whatnot, he said the photograph, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, photographs are not here to compete against the artist, it's here to liberate us. And how we can now take this to another level to become more creative. And then you had the birth of Cubism, you had the birth of Surrealism and all the other isms that didn't exist prior to photography. So I think I'm looking at it in the same way with 3D and sculpture. I mean, we have all these machines now, and not to be like John Henry competing against the steel mill, the railroad steel mill. How can we now put, in some ways it's good because now those of us, how can we do sculpture, how can we bring a creative aspect to it that you can't just get on a 3D printer, or you can't just get in just pure portraiture?
It's really interesting that you bring that up, because one of the highlights, for me at least, of the French Saint-Gaudens show is there's a section of the show where you have French's seated Lincoln and Saint-Gaudens seated Lincoln, French's standing Lincoln, Saint-Gaudens standing Lincoln. And we've all looked at the Lincoln Memorial countless times. So often when I see the Lincoln Memorial, I don't think about the sculpture that's in the center of it. You think about Marian Anderson, you think about Martin Luther King, you think about running up the steps as a kid, something like that. But the museum exhibition gives you an opportunity to look at it in a different context. And Wendy, how did you explore that with the exhibition that you were doing? Because you can't put a monument inside in the same way, and if you do, you're taking it out of the context. So how did you explore that?
Well, I mean, it's a really fascinating topic, and I'm so glad that it's part of the panel. I would hate to think that the artistry and the history are inimical. I think my institution is a little bit unique in being both an art institution and a history institution. And I think that in that way, the work that we're doing is constantly looking at art for our art exhibitions as agents of history. So we are always wanting to remind ourselves, remind our visitors that compositional choices, that an artist's interpretation, they shape history. They're not just passive reflections, they create history. And so, when you, as you say, when you bring these smaller objects, we did have one life-size monument, a decapitated sculpture of William Pitt outside the gallery, but the rest of our pieces were small-scale maquettes or reproductions, and I think you're right, the museum context lends itself to elicit an artistic interpretation of the works, and it also creates adjacencies, which allow us to look more closely and think about in juxtaposition one artist's compositional choices versus another. So one of the dialogues that I wanted to draw out across time and across the gallery was between this small equestrian recreation of that equestrian sculpture of King George III and Barbara Chase Rabeau's equestrian Never Realized monument to Sojourner Truth. And the Chase Rabeau sculpture might be one of my favorite objects in the entire collection. I mean, it's gorgeous, and it has these sort of cubist facets to it, which give a sense of Sojourner Truth's clothes billowing in the wind, but also read as a kind of armor that protect her. And she, unlike King George, is not presiding over the people. She's not mounted on her horse. She is dismounted. She is standing by the side of her emaciated horse, holding a lantern aloft and leading us with this light through an implied darkness. And I hope that the contrast between those two interpretations of this equestrian tradition can bring to the fore not just the artistic questions and the aesthetic choices, but how those aesthetic choices help to shape the way we read the people represented.
Yeah. And Michele, when you're thinking about this because I totally agree that the stories behind how did something get here, what's the process, the committees involved, there's a lot that goes on between the inception of a monument and its unveiling. And so many of what goes on is what we see in a museum exhibition, but we don't necessarily see in the public sphere. How do these types of maquettes and models and studies play into your explorations of the monuments that finally get to the public?
I'm trying to think, because there was a point I wanted to make before that, but the maquettes highlight it. So the thing about this show, and you all have to see the catalog and read the essays because they're really fantastic, and they take aesthetics very seriously, among other things. And one of the things that the maquettes kind of highlight, but also other parts of your show, are how different the art of sculptors like Saint-Gaudens and French, how different those two are. And I say that because there is this tendency now, to discuss these public works in a way that I believe sometimes levels their significance because it doesn't take account of the aesthetic aspects of it. So when you see, for example, when you take very seriously the differences between the way that a French work, Daniel Tester French works look, and the way Saint-Gaudens works look, you see they're not the same. So none of these works are the same, and that includes all aspects of them. In addition, they acquire, as Wendy points out with respect to the gallery context, they acquire meaning through the interaction of the aesthetic aspects of the materials. This is now talking about it, outdoor work. The choice of materials, the bronze, the light conditions. I mean, there are all sorts of contexts and circumstances that affect the way we're going to read these things in the public landscape. And those elements, and including space, the space around the work, the landscaping in situ, all of these things are part of what the works mean. And they are all they all evolved over time. There were decisions that had to be made. And now what one sees that's pretty cool is the way, say, New York City, and I'm sure in Philly also, all these city agencies have been trying very actively to support artists and give them work in the public realm. And it's not the old, it's not the older type of stuff. It ranges from the more figurative hero monuments, something akin to what you're doing, to other kinds of projects, like in New York City, you have the Percent for Art projects. They're all very supportive of artistic individuality. But then there are all sorts of other contingencies that come into play when you work with city government. So the aesthetics of the work is also an outgrowth of the process that goes into making it. And that's a very collaborative process that transcends the individual artist. The individual artist has to kind of, bite it at times. So it's challenging.
And when you were talking about all of the things that go into it, one of the things is the physical space, as you said. And when we think about the works from the late 19th century or the early 20th century, the space where they were originally installed may be the same physical space, but the social environment 100 years later or 130 years later can be totally transformed and transform our understanding of that, because the city is a vibrant, living, or the place where a monument is installed is a vibrant, living thing, and the monument is static. And I think that there can be, and we talked a little bit about this last week, that there can be a little bit of the way that environment impacts the way that we look towards the past, how we engage with the past in our present, and how monuments do that. I don't know if you want to comment on that, as you've designed some spaces for your sculpture in Baltimore.
I think one of the, and this is on topic, but may stray just a slight bit, but I think that the beautiful thing about monuments and what's happening nowadays in this present day within the last 4 years or so, in some ways to me can really, I'm not going to say save the art world, but can really kind of bring it back to the people in a way that I feel over the years, I'm not talking about recently, but over the last 70, 80 years, I think has become, especially the fine arts world, has become a very niche interest, where it's basically something that seems to only be recognized by collectors and wealthy buyers, Christie's auction, Sotheby's and whatnot, that the average person in the United States is left out of. When you think of what's relevant to our cultural interests, what's relevant to us as a society and a nation, what do we talk about in the house? We talk about maybe entertainment, movies, sports, music, whatever. Those are the things that we hold relevant. Art, especially the fine arts, has been left out of that conversation. And it, like I said, has been seen by, okay, you don't, like even some artists that might be highly successful, wealthy, are still not what you call kitchen table topics. So I think the great thing about public art is now the city becomes the canvas. And now people that not necessarily may focus on art or even see themselves as having an interest in the art world are now going to see all these different works of art just in public spaces, whether they be figurative, whether they be abstract. And that becomes part of the fabric of America, and it brings it back because now they become part of people's lives every day, that the gallery has not been able to offer. And in a sense, the gallery world has kind of moved further away from as years have gone on. And I think, it's, like I said, it's a great opportunity to kind of make art relevant again to the average American. And I just want to make one also thing, it's not in your last statement, Michele, but something you said in your first statement that kind of thought, I forgot what it was, but even this institution here, the Art Students League, one reason why I came here back in '96 was because it offered certain things that I couldn't find at SVA. But in the mid-'90s, the movement was installation art and really abstract, and that's kind of the way it was going. And it didn't offer a lot of education as far as traditional art goes. And that's what brought me to the league, because it was one of those institutions that kind of stuck to tradition. I was able to, even though it was very figurative, it's like, okay, well, how can I get those hard basic skills that I can do something with? My former instructor, Greg Kreutz, is sitting there. I was so glad to see him that, it's kind of like that I had back in '96. He came here tonight. And, I think it's just, this institution we're talking about is just special to even those of us that went into public art later on. So.
And it's fascinating, that part, that continuity part, in that continuing relevance, and something that you said just prior is that the public sphere allows us to, in the art in the public space is about what makes things relevant today. So often we're focused on these historical monuments as ways to view the past. But what you're suggesting, if I understand correctly, is that it's about ways that we're engaging today, that despite being very historical, that they're very much of this moment. And Michele, you're nodding, so.
Right. Well, I mean, that's a key shift in the outlook from, say, when I started looking at these monuments. Because I tend to be very historical in my orientation, and I think that's just fine, you know. But people are much more engaged with the work now because they've been encouraged to be so. And there's a monument that I had stuck in one of those slides of a statue called Civic Virtue, which is now in Greenwood Cemetery. It started in front of City Hall, so there might be a slide of it in front of City Hall. And that work was commissioned in 1908 by the mayor of the city of New York. It was not finished until 1922, so from 1908 to 1922, it's not done. When it's done, it is in the wake of the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, and there had been a shift in the orientation, and it's really one of the first, at least as far as I was tracking, apart from the George III, but it's one of those first works that really triggered a lot of backlash, and it was moved, but not until 1938, and it was done because the park was renovated, and LaGuardia and Robert Moses wanted to move it. They didn't like it. So it was a political decision by the two men. But that was one of the first situations that I encountered where public opinion actually started to matter. And over time, that has become a much more prominent and pervasive model. And now it is what really, I'd say, dominates the landscape. The museum is another space where this kind of engagement by everyday, normal people can occur, and you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, sure. With the museum context, I mean, when we are talking about the smaller scale works, I think it does it presents a shift in a hierarchy of scale. Because when we are going out into the public sphere, typically we're thinking about monuments that are large, that are meant to impress with their scale, that are meant to invoke a kind of admiration or awe if we stop to notice them. And then what I think looking in a museum context at a smaller scale maquette, at a smaller scale reproduction allows us to do is it gives us that physical distance that allows for critical reflection and to think about these works apart from in a different kind of power structure. But I love Alvin's comment about monuments taking art to the people. And, to me, they take art to the people, they take history to the people as well. And again, there's two sides of the same coin, really can't be divided. And we do tend to think of monuments as so permanent and so fixed, and they are in so many ways. But the monuments landscape is also always constantly changing. Old monuments come down, new monuments come up. Monuments are interpreted in different ways this decade versus last decade versus 50 years ago. And it's the same thing happens with history writ large. The past is not static, it's constantly changing as we rethink it. And so I think that, the entire monuments conversation is about remembering that we are all part of this collective and ongoing process that is centuries old, that is rewriting our own public history.
Questions? Because I'm not following that. No, thank you. And I did get the sign, so we'd love to have some questions. Yeah. That was fantastic.
Thank you. It's been a very nice discussion. I've enjoyed it very much. And a number of the comments and topics that you've all talked about, and that started coming into mind that hasn't been really discussed up front is, for instance, the change in sentiment about the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th centuries to the Confederacy, taking them down. I mean, the appropriateness of putting them in museums from an historical perspective, is that important? I'd like to get some idea of your thoughts and feelings about what's been going on there.
Who wants to start?
I'll start. And you just read my mind, because that was almost the topic that was on my mind for discussing before we wrapped up. And even to my original point about monuments and how they affect us, or what we saw growing up and the lack of representation. And when you start talking about the Confederate monuments that went up in the 1940s and 1950s, they went up to oppress. They went up to subject people to kind of a tyranny that said, okay, this land is not yours, this is what belongs to you, it belongs to us, not you. And you can argue it showed the power of monuments because it was unfortunately effective in many ways, and which is why I do believe that they need to come down, especially off public property, where you have everybody, blacks, white, red, Asian, whatever, paying for public space that now maintain monuments that were put up there to oppress them. Now, as an artist, I'm torn as to, I don't feel they should be destroyed. And some artists may disagree with me on that, especially if for certain things that hit home. I mean, a lot of my family's from the South. My mother's side is all from Mississippi, father's from North Carolina, those people. So I've been down the South all my life seeing these Confederate monuments, and it just became normal, and that's the sad part about it, it became normal. And I guess me, like I said, me as an artist and as a lover of history, I can't condone destruction of them, but they definitely need to be removed off public properties and put somewhere where they have proper context as to what they meant. But in the end of the day, whether it's General Lee or whether it's Custer or whatever, unfortunately, it is part of history and a part of a very dark side of our history of this country, but it's still history. And for me, my personal aspect, I don't believe in destroying history, but I do believe in putting it in proper context and putting it somewhere where you can learn from it so that it doesn't get repeated.
You want to say something? I'll just say I have a very unpopular point of view, which is I don't think, and I'll say first off, I totally understand why people want to remove them. And I am sympathetic to those sentiments. In other words, I'm not a Confederate. However, I've made the case that they should not be removed, precisely because they represent the dark side of America. They are part of history, and that it behooves us to look very carefully, again, at the circumstances in which they got to be there, and at whether, and sort of other aspects of them that may not fit into our present-day way of approaching them. So, for example, from a psychological dimension on the part of the people that put them up, things like that. And I'm not talking about the group psychology of wanting to oppress and have a display of power, because I get all that. As I say, I understand the motivations that people have. But because of the way I've approached my studies of these things, and I view them as very rich, complicated embodiments of process and of negotiation among a lot of different people with a lot of different motivations and self-interests or interests, I have felt that it would be better to use have counter programming, to have educational programming on site to bring people there to actually, again, look at the interaction of form and space and all these other things, to complicate things in ways that people haven't really been doing. So I am kind of a lone voice in this, and I accept that. But that's my take. That's my opinion.
Can I just...
Please, yeah.
And I understand where Michele is coming from. I guess for me, though, the problem with leaving them in place is that they're glorified. And I think for something that's educational purposes, they need to be put in some place where, whether it's museum or something like that, where it is for learning, but leaving General Lee in the center court of a town is not just about learning at that point, because it's put in there as a glorified, as a matter of fact, I mean, we were talking about Rushmore earlier. To my knowledge, if I'm correct, it sits right on the Native American reservation. So I mean, you know, they're great men to some people,
right.
But to other people, they could still be considered not so great. So,
of course.
I mean, I think we've got to be careful of how we glorify certain individuals, but I do feel that we should always learn from them. That's just my take.
I would just also raise the possibility and the recent history of art of interventions, which sort of straddle removal and not removal. I mean, I'm not going to remember which precise Confederate monuments they were, but the ones that had projections overlaid upon them to transform that monument in situ, or the monument that was, I mean, this was an in-depth intervention, but the Confederate monument that was taken down and melted down, as King George was, and used that metal, that bronze, was used to create a new monument. So I think interventions, whether they're in the museum context or in a way that can visually immediately make a difference, are another solution.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that there's also another aspect of when we talk about Confederate monuments or something in those contexts, you can have a firm opinion one way or another on it. There are so often in the public space with hero monuments, as I think that's a very apt term, we have people who are heroic in one sense, but may be objectionable in other senses. And how do we navigate something like that, someone who may be a great representative of certain values that we may want to promote, but has another aspect that is far more problematic. And I think that adds nuance to it. But there are more questions in the back I saw.
Could I just add one last point?
Please.
Just one little thing. I'm sorry. But in terms of using the monuments to glorify the subject, I don't think that in the present day that's necessary. In other words, I don't think that people in the present day need to assume that, that having a work like that, having a portrait monument, is a glorification of the subject. It was meant to have a glorification of the subject when it was put up, right? But that doesn't mean that it maintains that meaning in the present day, necessarily. So I don't want to, people have questions, but that's just something I want to say.
Hi, I just wanted to say something about monuments, memorials, and how we treat them or don't treat them as art. One of the things that I've done in my books and the books I've collaborated on with Share Harriet Senni, we italicize the names of monuments and memorials, as we do with works of art, because by not italicizing them, they're in this kind of really strange, they're not architecture, right? A building, we don't italicize that. And I'm mentioning this here in the hopes that all of you will pick up that practice, because I think that it might make a difference. On Confederate memorials, I agree. I think with most people, not with Michele, sorry, I think they should be in history museums because they are historical. I mean, that's a burden on history museums, but I think that that is a place where you can have a constructive conversation. I don't think they should be melted down because that is literally eliminating history, right? And I just have one more comment because I have never really quite figured out how to think about this. We talk about modifying works of art, putting another work of art in context, projecting things onto them, all of which are really interesting and can prompt really important conversations. We wouldn't do that to the written word, right? Oh, I don't like that paragraph. I think I'm going to change it. Or let's have somebody else write the conclusion to that chapter. I'm thinking that there are ways in which works of art are treated as a very distinct form of communication.
My name is Howard Burrell. Is this working? Yeah, I've done a lot of historic preservation work around the city the last number of years. One of my projects is Save Gould Library, which is the restoration of the Stanford White City, State, and National Historic Landmark at the Bronx Community College campus, along with the Hall of Fame for Great Americans and the flanking buildings. So what I'm going to say is my own and not the group's opinion. After or during the Floyd disturbances, shall we call them, some of which were peaceful, some of which were not, and I don't know the facts of this case yet, and I've been on it for 4 years. Someone gave the order to yank the busts of Lee and Jackson from the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, which has over 100 works commemorating, quote unquote, if you will, great Americans, mostly from the late 19th, early to mid 20th century, many of which, by the way, were done by French and Saint-Gaudens. So someone, probably the governor of the state of New York at that moment, gave the order to yank the busts and throw them into the basement of the library, which I think is where they are now. This is a city, state, and national historic landmark protected up the wazoo by rules and regulations as to what you can touch and can't touch. And one of the things you can't do to one of those landmarks is yank a piece and toss it into the basement. Very disturbing. I'm coming out with Michele on this. Very disturbing and a very disturbing process, or non-process, shall I say, and still absolutely unresolved. No one except myself in our group has spoken about this at all. No one. Very disturbing business.
I just think the gentleman makes an interesting point that, to some degree, I agree with. I mean, when I say things should be removed, we should remove them in a systematic way. I don't think riots and tearing them down through that method is the proper way, because obviously when these things are getting torn down, you don't have historians tearing them down. So a lot of times, and to your point, Andrew, it's another conversation that I think needs to be had just as a nation. When we start, who gets memorialized, who should stay, who should go? I mean, when you look at somebody like George Washington was a slave owner. He also founded a country. So, I mean, you have to really play those dualities with each other. And I think anybody that goes up, nobody's perfect, so you have to weigh in where there are atrocities, overweighing their attributes. And I think that's something that we're still going to be facing as time goes on with other monuments. But to the gentleman's point, tearing them down through riots is not the way to do it. I even heard, I don't know if it's true or not, or it's a rumor I saw or heard somewhere, I heard a John Brown monument might have been torn down during the riots. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I heard it. But just for the sake of argument, if it was, if you do the history on John Brown, he sacrificed himself and his life for liberating slaves. But if you didn't know that, you see a monument of a white man, you just tear it down if you're in a riot. So that's why I think it needs to be a system when you take these things down.
It's interesting when we're talking about the history and the impact of this conversation on history, and it reminds me of where we started, which was a conversation about a monument that was torn down, right? That still was the jumping off point for a show in a historical society. New York Historical Society, which also is obviously an art museum in that sense. And that the idea about history is still something that's so present. And whatever happens where we go with monuments, whatever it may be, I think to your point, they remain so relevant in terms of what we're doing every day, whether they're there, whether they're not there, whether they're torn down, whether there's an intervention. The history continues to emerge as the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and I think may continue. There's not a cut and dry answer for any of this, but it can allow us to continue to think about the past in ways that remain not just important, but necessary for how we consider today and also our futures. So, thank you.